Hello, the program Stan the History Man, and I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. You know, a lot of people believe that Charles Lindbergh was the first guy to fly the Atlantic nonstop. And, it was actually Robert Ripley, believe it or not, said actually Lindbergh was like the 92nd person to fly the Atlantic. He had all kinds of hate mail, with Lindbergh, the all-American boy, but it's actually true. The first person to fly the Atlantic nonstop was two Englishmen, Alcock and Brown, who flew in 1919 and barely made it to from England to Newfoundland. Second, after that, that was June of 1919. Only a month afterwards, July of 1919. You have the dirigible, the R-34, a British dirigible, which flew from England to Mineola, Long Island, all the way. Barely made it though. It just had just a little bit of fuel left for its engines. And there's an interesting point. The Americans didn't know much about dirigibles. The British had quite a fleet of them during the war, R1, R-34, and also a whole list of them. And so they had a guy on board who was very airship skilled, and they had him parachute down from the R-34, about 100 feet up in the air, to organize the landing crew. The guy's name was Major J.E.W. Pritchard. And wouldn't you know it, Pritchard was killed only 2 years later in the crash of the R-38, okay, which should tell you something about dirigibles. But they winched down, and Pritchard also has the distinction of being the first person to arrive in America, in the United States, by air. And he was actually American descended, so I guess you could say he did descend into America. Again, the R-34 made a return trip also to England without too much trouble. But on its way down to the States over the St. Lawrence River, it was almost ripped apart by storms and so on. That sort of indicates just what the problem with the dirigible was. And I'll talk about in another show later why the dirigibles were such a failure. And so we can say, well, the R-34 flew across without any problems, but it was very fortunate. It was almost ripped apart and it almost ran out of fuel. There was the R-100 later, and I'll talk about this, also almost came to grief when it flew to Canada. But anyway, just to talk that Lindbergh was not the first man to fly the Atlantic. So what did Lindbergh do? He's the first guy to fly nonstop New York to Paris. And it's solo, okay? And that got him this aviation prize that was which was offered at the time, and that really got him. He made his country very aviation minded to do that sort of thing and to do it single handedly. He always had his book called "We," like he and the Spirit of St. Louis, his airplane. Lindbergh, in many ways, a tragic figure. It shows how fame can really sour. He was easily the most famous man in America. Maybe only Charlie Chaplin at the time could give him any competition. But as many of you know, his son was kidnapped and killed, whether murdered or in an accident, we don't know. And we talk about the vicious press, the paparazzi today. They were awful at that time. They drove him crazy. He left America. He just couldn't stand it anymore. Then he came back and was very prominent in the America First movement, which was to keep America out of the war, before Pearl Harbor. And he got to be almost sounding matter of fact, he got a prize from the Germans when he was over there, a medal, which he said, I didn't know I was going to get it. They kind of sprung it on me. What am I supposed to do? Just hand it back to Goering, the Nazi Luftministerium. But that was held against him also. And he made some remarks about the Jews, they better be careful. They might get it. That can be interpreted as anti-Semitism. I think he had sort of a moral compass that was somewhat askew, not seeing the danger of the Nazis and just saying, well, the Jews are asking for trouble. And, after the war, I was reading his diary, and he's driving in a, he goes to Belsen, I think it's one of the concentration camps, and he says, it's awful that humanity has descended to this. It wasn't humanity, it was the Nazis. And it was the rest of the free world that liberated those camps. But he was, humanity has descended to this level. And he was very much into this sort of blood plasma, which, of course, the Nazis went for as well, the pure Aryan race. Much, much later, we found out that he went back to Germany almost in his old age and impregnated 5 German women. to produce super babies. So he was one of the greatest aviators that we've ever had. As a matter of fact, during the World War II, he Roosevelt wouldn't allow him to get in the Air Force. Roosevelt said, "You can tell me what you want. I think Lindbergh's a fascist." So Roosevelt doesn't want him. The Air Force can't have him either. But he did become a tech rep for the company that made Corsairs, which is one of the best, maybe the best fighter plane of World War II. And the guy's like 45 years old now, passed it as a fighter pilot, but he's testing out. He made real contributions showing the Air Force how they can, and the Navy Air as well, how they can extend their flight over these vast distances, how, lean your fuel and go twice as far. So he really, he earned his money. But while doing this, while, experimenting with this Corsair, he runs across a Japanese Zero, which was no mean opponent, and he shoots the Zero down at the age of 45. I mean, it's not impossible. I'm saying that's quite a pilot. They say there's old pilots and old pilots, but there are no old pilots. And maybe at 45 is not old, but it's old enough. So anyway, I want to say Lindbergh, for all of his great, in the undeniable achievement of flying New York to Paris single-handed, was later on. I think he kind of went a little funny. One last thing I should say about Lindbergh also. All the other people are competing for this prize had big multi-engine planes, and sometimes they had like stoves on board and all the comforts of home. Lindbergh said, "I just want to get from New York to Paris. That's all. I don't care about how I go." And so he just stripped down. He had some sandwiches and a pot of coffee, and that was it. So again, the guy really, one of the greatest aviators we've ever had, even though perhaps morally he was somewhat flawed. Well, that's Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and thank you again for tuning in.